we went through Wycliffe. That's what we were going to go through tonight, and his period of time in which he lived. And Wycliffe was a great Bible scholar. And all my other notes are all marked up real good. But he worked among the people. He taught basic Bible doctrines in England. They were very persecuted. And he and another brother, and I can't think of right now, that he had written a translation of the Scriptures that's very famous. And Tyndale also taught Baptist doctrines all over. He ran wherever he was, and so did Wycliffe. Tyndale knew the Scriptures so well that he could go to one country to the other, and they thought he was a native of that country, speaking those languages. And he knew basically all the European languages plus Greek and Hebrew. And they said that he was so fluent in these languages, they didn't know. They were after him all the time to arrest him for preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, basically. But they couldn't catch him, because he would go in and act just exactly like the people where he was going and speak just like them. He was an absolute talented linguist. And, of course, Tyndale's translation and the history of it and the impact of that translation of the Bible is still in the world today. And Wycliffe also. They taught basically all of the Baptist doctrines that we talked about. And we're in about 1000 to 1300 AD right now. That's the period of time we're going into at this time. John Wycliffe, I was going to read his statement of faith tonight. I don't have it in my hand. Have any of you got John T. Christian's book with you? Because that's where I'm going to go out of. I'll do it next week. We'll go into another thing. Anyway, he taught that churches were independent. Basically independent bodies, democratic bodies of believers that had no head except Jesus Christ. That's all. He also taught in the grace of God, that salvation was wholly by grace and no mixture between works and grace at all. He taught, as Baptists have always taught, that church members should be separate and holy from the world. They demanded, if you were a Baptist church member at that time, they demanded that you live a holy life, because you should show that your life had been changed. We're going to go and this thing here, we're going to go through here, and basically, this is the same thing. This is the Paulicians. Remember how the Paulicians came in. Wycliffe and Tyndale were descendants of these Paulicians. All right? They were simple descendants of these people. And we're going to read this. This is printed in Old English. When did the printing in English change from Old English printing to the modern English printing that we have today? You remember what year that was? 1800. 1800. So this book really, this is one of the last books, 1798, 99, and 1800. They changed the printing. So you wouldn't have to read the S's and the final S's like you will in this little book here. Tyndale and Wycliffe were both descendants of these people. The Lord said in Matthew 16 and 18, He said, talking to Peter and to his church, He said, you are Peter, but, that's a conjunction, but, and it's an adversity conjunction, but upon this rock, thou art Peter, a little rock, but upon this great foundation stone I shall be building the assembly of me, and the gates of hell will not wrestle her down. And then he said in the last chapter of the book of Matthew, he says, and lo, I'll be with you even unto the end of the age. He's talking to his assembly again. He said that church would be in existence all the way through the church age. It would be continuous. There would be bodies of believers, New Testament, true New Testament churches all down through the ages. It didn't say there weren't that there weren't going to be others. Because the Lord, when the Lord does something, the devil does 100 things to try to confuse people. We have hundreds of false religious systems in the world today. And we had a whole bunch of them here. The true New Testament churches, the nucleus of them in Rome and in Constantinople became twisted and turned into what we know now as what evolved into the Catholic Church. Okay? All of those doctrines did not begin in 37 AD or 100 AD. It evolved. I don't believe in evolution at all, except in church history. It's not true in the species crossing and going back and forth, and because you find all those species today if there was. But I'll guarantee you, every form of evolution and perversion of the Word of God, you're going to find it in some form and in every form, and every twisted form of it in the world today. Somewhere. From a little bit sprinkling of error to a whole mass of error out in the so-called the Christendom world that we deal with. On page 567, and this is volume 2 of John Lawrence von Mosheim's Ecclesiastical History of the Christian Church. Mosheim was a Lutheran theologian. These Baptists and these people were his enemies. But he was honest, an honest historian. So thank God for that. You wouldn't have, Baptists couldn't write their own histories. They couldn't write their own. All their books, all the Bibles, all the histories of them, basically by them, it has been burned and destroyed. Only the enemy's words remain. And here is a Lutheran. All right? And by the way, we're talking about Luther and Lutherans now. Who was the first Hitler? Who was the first Hitler? Martin Luther. Did you know that? He laid the ground for Adolf Hitler and his ideas and persecution of the Jews. Martin Luther called for the incarceration and imprisonment of every Jew in the world. That they should be put in work camps, that the men should be neutered, and they should be worked until there's not one of them left in the world. That was his idea, because they had crucified the Messiah. He could not see that God had a final plan for the nation of Israel in end times. So many people have just literally looked over that. God has had a plan for the nation of Israel and still has a plan for her today. And in the end times, she'll be great and she will glorify God. She will finally glorify God. God divorced her and set her aside for a time. But she's going to come back and she's going to glorify God on this earth for 1,000 years. Now, they could not see that, and they hated Jews. There was anti-Semitism so bad now that John Calvin, all the reformers hated Jews because they had crucified the Messiah, and they couldn't see the end time calling back of Israel and when God would call them back into the land and how he would deal with them. They absolutely just refused to think that Israel would ever have any part in God's plan at all. And they totally spiritualized everything that had to do with Israel and turned it to the church because they didn't understand those things. God had a plan for them, and I'm going to tell you some of the greatest miracles of history has been the nation of Israel that has survived. That's one of the greatest miracles of the world. Now, I don't like what the Jews did for the Lord either. I don't like what they did to James or anything. How many of you ever heard of the book of Josephus? All right. There are many translations of Josephus. Some of the translations and commentaries on Josephus are so perverted that you can never see what he really wrote. He was, when they killed James outside, or James and Stephen, he was just totally, those were ghastly murders, is what they were. And the nation of Israel did it. And all of many of the reformers later on down through the ages, when they quoted Josephus, they said either Josephus was a reprobate or else Josephus was a semi-Christian. And they took these works and just tore it up. Josephus is really a good work. You can find out about the nation of Israel and what happened to them, simply. He was Jew. He didn't agree with all the things that they were doing, and especially not the stoning of Stephen and the killing of James. He said that was murder. And the nation of Israel murdered. The high priests and the Pharisees murdered these people without a trial. It was murder. Well, they murdered Jesus too, even though they had a mock trial for him, because he was counted innocent, wasn't he? Pilate counted him innocent. You're going to find out that the trail marks, the paths that these reformers left in history, perverted the thinking of many of God's people when it comes to the interpretation of God's Word. It really twisted it up. And Brother Rod, you can look at history now, and you can go back as you've taken this class and see some things and kind of untangle some of it sometimes. I'm just absolutely delighted, because that's what I want to be able to do with you. I want you to be able to go and look at history and read it and untangle some of the things out there. Because I'll tell you what, just because something's printed in a book does not make it right. It doesn't mean it's truth. That's absolute. It just doesn't mean that something on printed paper is truth. You have to really filter through a lot of it. Got a couple of things for you too. Here. This is a copy out of an old book of mine. I was going to bring the old book tonight, but how many of you have seen that book printed in 1798? It's falling apart.
Yes, yeah.
It's falling apart. But this is really it. It's Mosheim's history. And these same doctrines that are printed here are quoted over and over again in history. The Waldenses basically taught this thing. Tyndale taught this. Wycliffe taught this. The Paulicians that we're talking about were the originators. How did the Paulicians get started, by the way? How did the name Paulicians? We know that they always existed all the way back to Christ. And they always taught that. Your sister, you know that, don't you? Mm-hmm. How did it get started?
Following the teachings of Paul.
Following the teachings of Paul. All right. In Armenia, there was a man over there by the name of Constantine. And there was a Baptist deacon running from persecution that ran upon this guy. Remember the story? All right. And he came to his home, and he stayed in his home. And this deacon had a whole copy of the New Testament. He had it all. Baptists throughout the world at that time, many places throughout Europe, they were always there, and through England, Ireland. Remember how Ireland was gospelized? Through Patrick. All right? And he was not a Catholic. Patrick was a Baptist. He went in there and he taught Baptist doctrine. He established 365 churches, baptized, they say, over 100,000 people. By the way, grown, mature believers, not infants. Grown, mature believers on the profession of their faith. He established churches, and he established pastors and deacons in all those churches. And all of them were independent bodies. All adhering to the doctrines that we're going to talk about right here. So if you take him there and you say, the Catholics say, he was our saint, well, he sure didn't adhere to the Catholic doctrines, did he? Matter of fact, the Catholic Church was fighting him. What the ancestors of it was fighting him because they remember already we have 251 AD with Novatian and Cornelius' splitting. We have a little bit later on we have the Council of Nicaea banning everybody that didn't exactly walk like they walked, and nobody could have a church couldn't exist in a town unless it was the authorized church out of Constantinople or Rome. Okay? So everybody else was heretics. And it was against the law to preach. And Patrick was one of them. One of the heretics, so-called. One of the people that was not authorized to go in there and spread the gospel. Okay, on page 567. And I'll read this to you, and you can kind of read it with me. And the Old English I've told some of you heard this 2 or 3 times. In Old English printing, there was an S at the end of the word and an S in the word. Greek, there is a sigma and a sigma. All right? And of course, English comes from the Greek language. Basically, our printing came from Greek. And Greek has 2 S's, and English had 2 S's to begin with. And 1800, they dropped off this S. They said, we'll do away with it. But right here, this is before 1800. So you're going to see this. Now, you don't say it's, when you say Congress, like in the preamble to the Constitution, it's Congress. It's not an F, it's an S. Okay? And it will say like this. You'll see it like that. That's 2 S's. One in the word and one final S. All right? How many of you knew that? Anybody before I taught you? All right. Okay. Now these people had, at this period of time, these people had existed for 1,200 years already, these Paulicians. Now this is what they believed. Now, it says here that they treated all external modes of worship as absolutely contemptible. They didn't believe in bowing down and kissing the altars and all the things that the Catholic Church was doing in the church at this time. They didn't believe in any idols and everything, and we're going to read specifically what they said here. They rejected baptism. Look at that word baptism there. It's baptism. That's baptism, not tifum. Okay? That's that S. The non-final S. They rejected baptism and in a special, look at that word, special there. All right? A special manner, the baptism of infants. See the word infants? See that final S there? That's just fine. And it's those S's in the word that throw you off. All right? The baptism as a ceremony that was in no respect essential to salvation. Wycliffe and Tyndale taught the same thing. They said infant baptism was not necessary. Baptism was not necessary at all for salvation. Baptism is a work of faith that follows salvation. Doesn't have anything to do with salvation. Now, they didn't reject baptism. All right? They rejected the baptism of the Catholic Church. In England and in these places later on, we'll find out we have 2 groups. We have 2 groups of Baptists. The ones that held closest to the words and church authority were what they called the particular Baptists. Brother Fred, you probably heard about those particular Baptists. All right? They held closer to the doctrines and authority of the church. And Baptist churches would not accept baptism by anyone but other Baptist churches of like faith and order only. All right? They just, and if you were, I don't care if you were dipped 1,000 times by somebody else, the Church of England or the Catholic Church, they wouldn't accept that as baptism because the authority was placed in New Testament churches at the time of Jesus, and it would be carried out by the authority in those churches. And if you had departed from that faith, you no longer had the authority to do it. And they particularly held to that church authority, all right, down through the ages, that it had been passed on from generation to generation in these churches. They did not reject baptism at all, but they rejected the efficacy of the saving ability of baptism. They baptized saved people. And they immersed them, because that's the only form of baptism there is. What's the 3 terms in Greek for baptizing, or that we would see? If they sprinkled, what would it be? Rontizo. Okay, if they poured, it would be nipto. If they immersed, it was baptizo. Simple as that. There is no... And if you read lexicons, they will try to make excuse for what they believe. Do you believe it's a Church of England or some Protestant that wrote this thing? They're going to appeal Baptist. You're going to see them. Well, the form really matters. It doesn't matter. It's the idea. And they'll say bapto and this, that, but you're not going to find it in the New Testament anywhere. Bapto means to dip. Our word and verse would come right out of the Latin equivalent of that, which is mergio. All right? Let's go down here. Number 2. They rejected for the same reason the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. Did they reject the Lord's Supper? No. What did the Catholic Church teach about the Lord's Supper?
That was also necessary.
It was necessary for salvation, that it was a mode or a means or a vehicle of transferring grace from God to you. Okay? It was a means of transferring grace. The Lord's Supper was. These churches said that the Lord's Supper was a memorial supper only. It was that each church, each local church, and they were very particular about this. How many have ever heard of J.R. Graves? You haven't heard. Old landmark is. Those Baptist churches throughout antiquity held that. They wouldn't go to another church and take the Lord's Supper with them if they were having the Lord's Supper. They wouldn't do it. They believed in close communion. And they held that. These churches are holding to that. And that's one of the things that J.R. Graves fought so hardcore in the 1800s and early 1900s was that each New Testament church, the authority of baptism and taking the Lord's Supper, that these were church ordinances to be carried on by that church. All right? When you're sent out as a missionary, you're a missionary from a church. You have authority from a church, a specific church, to baptize. The church is baptizing, not you. The sacrament of the Lord's Supper. What does the Protestant world teach, basically? A lot of the Protestant world today. It's what you call consubstantiation, not transubstantiation. Where in the Lord's Supper, transubstantiation means what?
Literally.
When the priest rings the bells and goes through the motions and the ceremonies, that wafer turns into Jesus, real flesh, that he's really there. Is that right, Buck? I'm your sister. That's what they teach you in catechism. And in the confirmation, they teach you have to believe that or you won't have any salvation. They say that, don't they? I mean, you've got to believe this or you're not going to make it to heaven. As simple as that. That's strong bonds in this. Well, it just isn't so. Luther and Calvin both came out of the Catholic Church. Some of Calvin's, some Presbyterian churches, and just about all Lutheran churches teach what is called consubstantiation. Consubstantiation. What does consubstantiation mean?
Is it the spiritualized part of it?
It's spiritualized. That Jesus Christ is really there in the bread and in the wine. He's really there, but it's not literal. This is really, we're partaking of his body and his blood, but it's not literally Christ. It is, but it isn't. All right, it's the Spirit, brother.
You know, being a former Presbyterian, when communion was given, this represented the body and blood of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't the body and blood of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
But we do it in remembrance
Mm-hmm.
of Christ.
Okay, now many Presbyterian churches don't believe that today. There are some that do. Okay? But as far as I know, all Lutheran churches do believe it, and many Presbyterian churches, but not all of them. Where in your different, almost in the areas, James Boyce had a great influence on all the churches back in the East and Pennsylvania and all through that area. He had a tremendous, the end times that he taught, the eschatology that he taught, which was basically pre-millennial and everything. He had a tremendous influence on those Presbyterians back there and on the Lord's Supper, too, on the giving of the Lord's Supper. But in some other places they might teach consubstantiation, where you're partaking of the body and blood of Jesus Christ. It's not literal, but there it is, okay?
What about the Baptist churches who believe that that the feet washing was also an ordinance.
Well, that's free will baptism.
Yeah, I know.
All right. That's, well, it just wasn't an ordinance. I wouldn't argue with them for 5 minutes about it. But there are 2 ordinances in the Lord's churches. Now they try to bring that foot washing. I tell you what, it wouldn't hurt us one bit if we humble ourselves and wash each other's feet. To be servants, because that's what Jesus taught. He said, "You want to be great? Wash somebody's feet." But it wasn't an ordinance. It just wasn't an ordinance. And it wouldn't, I mean, we ought to love each other like that. That's what we ought to do.
Well, that's what he taught. It says in there that you ought to. So we were taught that's one of the things you ought to do.
Well, like I said.
And Jim, I argued with him for 17 years. It was an example. It was not a commandment.
It's not an ordinance.
Yeah.
Okay? They argue that it is an ordinance. Okay. All right. And it just isn't. Now, the Lord's Supper we do in remembrance of Him. The Lord said to His churches that I'll be with you wherever you meet. Where 2 or 3 come together in my authority, I'm going to be there. So He's going to be with us, okay? We know that. We know He's here, and what that is a memorial supper. It's fellowship with Christ with that body of believers, right there, okay? The one loaf that we are now doing here, the one loaf typifies that one body of believers and the once and for all offering that Jesus made for us. He wasn't supposed to be sacrificed 1,000 times. When you have consubstantiation or transubstantiation, you know what you're doing? You're sacrificing the Lord again and again and again. And remember the one age in the 7 churches of Asia, which meant continual sacrifice. Continual sacrifice. Number 3. They denied that the churches were endowed with any greater degree of sanctity than private houses, or that they were more adapted to the worship of God than in any other place. The Catholic Church and even at this period of time, the Protestant churches were springing up all over the world, and Baptist churches basically were meeting in people's houses and still hiding out. Churches are groups of people. They're called out groups of people. The church house is a building. All right. The Greek term for that church house was synagogue. That's the place where people are gathered. The Hebrew term for that was moed. All right? The place of gathering. But the Lord didn't say that the churches were to be holy. As a matter of fact, Jesus told the Pharisees, read the Matthew, the 23rd chapter. Okay? He said, you swear by, not by the temple, but the gold that's in the temple. All right? And you swear by something that's in the temple, the offering in the temple or whatever. A lot of what was going on with the Pharisees when he said that they were robbing the widows and the orphans and abusing their rights, their administration of the kingdom at that time, their administration came until the preaching of John, and they were done away with. The Lord just zipped that shut. Changed from that administration to where He called His little assembly out, and John had gone out calling it out as a forerunner of Christ, hadn't he? And He just turned it off. The idea is the believers that were called out. Not the building, but the believers. Jesus talked to these people. He says, you're taking the money away from your mothers and fathers, your elderly mothers and fathers. And they would say, Corban. Corban. How many of you ever heard that term? Corban. What was the word Corban mean? It meant gift. It meant a set aside, consecrated. For instance, if your family had $1 million, you were supposed to take care of mom and daddy. When they got old, if you were the elder son, you were supposed to take care of your parents. That was your job. There wasn't no such thing as Social Security and rest homes. And these Pharisees were so selfish as to say that all of my income when I die is consecrated to the temple of God. I can't give it to my parents. I can't help it out because I have dedicated all of my money to the temple. So they got out of taking care of mom and dad.
Didn't when they repeated that something like 3 times, it released them from taking care of their parents too?
Yes. Yeah, they did. All of it was selfishness. They had consecrated, but they did whatever they wanted to with their own money. They did it. Also, Jesus got on to them for swearing. Swearing. Don't swear. Do not swear on the temple money, the temple treasury, what's on the temple, or anything about the temple. It's not the ground and the building that was holy. It is the God who dwelled there. All right? You're swearing, and they were actually breaking the law because they were not using the name of God in vain. But they, like somebody would say, I swear by the God of heaven that I'm telling you the truth. That's what they would say. I'll swear by the temple of Herod that I'm telling you the truth. I swear this, I swear that. I swear, I swear, I swear. The early Christians at this time would not swear at all. They'd say yes and no. When they answered, they didn't need any adjectives or anything to prove that they were telling the truth. Any more than yes or no. They said that the churches that were being built, these great assembly halls, that nobody was going in except the big shots. The great Sistine Chapel, and so on and so forth. Who's assembled there mostly? Not the common man. Not the common man. But the archbishops and the bishops and the pope and all of those. Everybody else had to stay out on the pavement. And they said those so-called holy places are not holy at all. There's nothing to them. You can worship any place. Wherever 2 or 3 gather together in my name, I'll be with you. Number 4, they affirmed that the altars were to be considered in no other light than heaps of stones, and that they were therefore unworthy of any marks of veneration or regard. What are we talking about here, sister?
Yeah, and also where they have where they do the Lord.
Yeah, the Eucharist. And where the saints are, different places. You have a certain saint that helps you out in this problem or that turn. There's an altar down there in front of them, and there's some place to kneel. Mm-hmm. And the stations of the cross. All of this, there are places to kneel. And that these altars are not sacred at all. They're only... This is... You know what that is? That's carpet. That's cheer. That's not a sacred carpet. That's not a sacred cheer, is what they would say. It's just a cheer. Don't bow down and kiss that thing, because it carries no power in itself. If there's any power in an altar, it's of demons, not of God. Because God told us not to make any image of anything other than in the water that flies in heaven or on earth or anything that was created or might be created or was created. Just forget it. Then it says, and number 5, that they disapproved of the use of incense and consecrated all in the services of religious nature. The use of incense. I wonder why they said this. What was the Catholic Church doing? It had become an absolute reproduction of the Old Testament times. Remember when the priests did the offerings and all of that in the Old Testament? What were these supposed to do? What were those Old Testament offerings supposed to do? What were they supposed to tell us? Got another little pamphlet for you. What were those things supposed to do?
The incense? What were the incense supposed to do?
Yeah, what were all of those little ceremonies that they went through in the Old Testament?
Obedience to God?
No. What were they supposed to do? Supposed to do something. Got some brand new papers here.
Dwayne says, looking forward to.
Looking forward to. They were supposed to point them to Christ. They were not supposed to worship that. This tells you a little bit about the altars and sacrifices and everything in there. This was written by the same man here, by the way. Remember I told you about one of my teachers that slept in the bed with Jesse James?
Yeah.
Well, this is him. The guy wrote this. His family hid out Jesse James when he was robbing banks and stuff back there. He was a great Baptist deacon. That's what he was. He was a Robin Hood of that day. And he went from Baptist church to Baptist church, hiding out, and Ben Bogart's father and mother hid him out and let him sleep in the bed with Ben Bogart. He said he slept in there with that great big old Smith & Wesson right on his chest. He said he sat there all night long just like this, just delighted. Their champion. The champion of the coffin man. Anyway, he wrote that little thing. That shows you that the offerings were point to Christ. When Christ came, what use were the offerings? It was all nullified. Now, what do you say? Well, the Old Testament times, the Jews had a temple, didn't they? Does the Catholic Church have a temple? Yeah. They're Vatican. The great temple. And the Jews had one great temple in Jerusalem, but they had synagogues, places of meeting, and basically the Catholic Church has copied that. The priest had garments, holy garments, and holy knees. These garments and things were supposed to point us to Christ. Everything in the tabernacle and the temple pointed us to Christ. Okay? It wasn't Christ, it pointed them to Christ. They had the offerings and the sacrifices. They had the incense, which typified the prayers of God, or of the Son of God for His people, and of the saints in His churches. These things typify. Now, after we have Christ come and He's offered as a sacrifice on the cross of Calvary, is there any more need for this? A duplication of that would be nothing but blasphemy, wouldn't it? To sacrifice Him again on the cross, sacrifice Him. He was offered once for all. All right? Once for all. And that's what they're saying here. They disapproved of the use of incense and consecrated all the services and religious nature. Number 6, they looked upon the use of veils in the churches as an intolerable superstition. Do you know why they ring bells in Catholic churches?
Ward off evil spirits.
Ward off evil. That was the original thing. Ring bell, and in all heathen services, wherever you go, they do something to drive away the evil spirits. And that was the purpose of the bells, to drive away the evil spirits. Well, the Lord's here with us. We don't need some superstitious thing to drive away evil spirits. Finally, later on, over in this country, they would ring the church bells when it was time to go to church, because not everybody had a water barrel. Watch to go by. Or maybe their rooster wasn't quite in time with the clock of the sun. They rang those bells, but for so many years, Baptists wouldn't have anything to do with that, because there was a pagan ceremony, a pagan influence behind it.
What was so supposedly special about a bell that could affect the unseen world?
It was superstitious, simply superstitious.
Somebody has decided to say that without any explanation.
This superstition. It came right out of paganism. They denied that the establishment of bishops and presbyters and deacons and other ecclesiastical dignities was a divine institution that went so far as to maintain that the appointment of stated ministers in the church was entirely needless. They really denied pastors and deacons. No. Remember, all of the early churches. Now John Lawrence von Mosheim here, he's a Lutheran. And Lutherans have bishops. And they have overseers over areas. And they have great heads of the churches that dictate to lower people what they do. And they have a hierarchy system just like the Catholic Church. He came out of the Catholic Church. All right? They didn't believe in the establishment of elders, rulers in the church. That's simply what they did. That none of these offices, churches were made up of every individual in that church, was part of that church. And they were the ones that made the decisions of what they're going to do. Remember in this church, what we do here in this church. When they get ready to build something for somebody, everybody that's a member in this church, they vote on doing it. Not the pastors. The pastors say, this is what we should do, but the people make the decision. We have to do that. We are the ones that are responsible for it. Not them. They're servants. They ordained, these churches, these coalitions ordained pastors and deacons. But they were servants of the church. They were not masters of the church. We have changed from church democracy, all right, to elder or Presbyterian rule. Only the ordained people, only the holy people in the church, only the pastors made the decisions. And they ruled the congregations. And what these coalitions did, they denied that. Okay, number 8. They affirmed that the institution of funeral rites was an effect, a sacerdotal avarice, and that it was a matter of indifference whether the dead were buried in churches or in the fields. Remember what the Catholic Church did? What is the whole idea of the Catholic Church? Manipulation of the masses, control of the masses. How do you control the masses? How do you control people's lives? How do you gain control of people's lives?
Indoctrinate them from birth.
Well, you indoctrinate them, but what do you do? What do you do? How is the best way to gain control? What does everybody do? Almost everybody gets married and almost everybody dies. When you're born into this world, they demanded within 9 days that you were to be baptized or else somebody's going to die or go to jail or be fined. Okay? Because you were a citizen of the state. You got the citizen of the state involved in that. You were a citizen of the church. If you were a Lutheran, Germany is a Lutheran, was a Lutheran state, basically. Church of England completely controlled England. Rome controlled many countries and controlled basically all of them for a number of years until Baptists were fighting there all the time, not fighting for control of areas and countries, simply for the right to preach. That's all. They didn't fight a war for any reason as far as going out and taking over a country and becoming a master of any country. They didn't care anything about temporal things. All they wanted to do was preach the gospel and teach and raise their children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, and that was all. They didn't care anything about any king or anything. They would obey the rules. They would go and fight in the war if they had to. They would pay their taxes. They would do all of these things whatever country that they lived in. But they didn't care anything about establishing a Baptist state. But when Luther came out of the Catholic Church, he just repeated what he had learned over there. When Calvin came out, he established his church state. Every Protestant that came out of the Catholic Church established basically the same order that was in the Catholic Church. They just repeated it, but they didn't answer to the Pope. Many of them became popes, basically. They were the Pope. They didn't want anybody to tell them what to do, but they wanted to tell everybody else what to do. Funeral rites. Now, if the church, they already got up here, it says they rejected baptism of infants. The Catholic Church and these state churches, wherever they were, in England, whatever state where they were in, whatever church was in control, you had so many days to baptize your children, and they could become a member, a citizen of the state, and a citizen of the church, a member of the church, and they would be in the role of the kingdom of God, basically. These people disagreed with that. They said it was not right. And they also said, now, we're going to get the marrying thing in just a minute. But when somebody died in your family, they weren't going to get to heaven unless you buried them. You got a license to bury them. You had to get a license to bury somebody. And so they would, and they would have to bury them in a churchyard. And they said that if they weren't buried in a churchyard, they would not be in heaven. They would be in purgatory or limbo forever and ever and ever. And they would be out there in the twilight zone. They'd never get to heaven if they weren't buried in a church yard where the Catholic Church had given them a certificate of death and the allowance to bury them in the churchyard. And it costs a lot of money to bury your loved one down in the aisle 1 of Catholic Church or whatever. You know what I'm talking about, don't you, young lady? What's that?
That one people went to in the actual, they had tombs in the actual.
In the floor. Yep, they'll have tombs in the floor and in the walls of many Catholic churches. Go look at them. Go look at all the old missions. Yeah. They're buried all in the outside, and the most holy people, the ones that paid the most, were inside in the floors and in the walls of those church buildings. It said here it says they disagreed that it didn't do you any good at all to bury in a church house or a church burial yard. Brother Fred.
Yeah, in Acts 14, verse 23, it speaks about the ordination of elders. So as a church officer, or as the office of the church, one is
well, an elder. See, I'm called an elder. I'm an ordained minister. I'm an elder. Baptist pastors have always been called elder, not reverend. Okay, and that's what the term president. It means the leaders in a church, the elders, pastors and deacons are elders. But there's no such thing as a presbytery or a Presbyterian rule in churches. The elders that is spoken of there is simply, you could group that under pastors and deacons.
I'm trying to find a place I had marked where Paul and the others, whether it was John Mark or who, but they met as a presbytery.
They had association meetings just like our. And you'll find in the Bible they have voluntary meetings of the pastors in different places. They would meet and talk about missionizing and voluntarily grouping together, sending offerings. And you'll find that as associations and conventions. That's what it's talking about there. The elders of the churches would meet, the pastors and the deacons would go out and they would meet in different areas. They would send messengers of these elders. But these weren't the people that ruled the church, remember now. When you're talking about presbyters, like in the Presbyterian church or whatever, these are the people that actually make the decision for the churches. Baptist churches, the people that make the decision are not the pastors, but the congregation. It's congregational rule. It's a different church government. It's a democracy. And that form of government is Presbyterian government that you're talking about there.
No, we're speaking as a republic rather than a democracy.
Yeah, a democracy. Baptists have always said that each church is a democracy. All right. Do you have pastors and deacons in those churches that are servants of the people? They're not. They're not overbearing. It's not preacher rule. It's not deacon rule. They're servants of the churches. You'll see it, and you're going to get. That's basically what it said up here. And then it says in number 9 that they looked upon those voluntary punishments called penance, which were so generally practiced in this century as unprofitable and absurd. What was penance?
A form of punishing yourself.
A form of punishing yourself. All right. What were some of the penances that they called on you to do as a Catholic? You remember?
Prayers.
You would say so many Hail Marys
So many Our Fathers.
and Our Fathers.
When you think about that, it's kind of sad. You've been a bad boy. Your punishment is to pray to God.
Yeah.
You know.
It
That's kinda
contradicted him.
But actually, it's diverting you away from God.
Well, you probably get more Hail Marys than you do on Fathers anyway.
Yeah. But it was and they would, for instance, in the Catholic Church, and this was going on at this time, remember. What was Luther doing when he went up there and he got all excited when he was supposed to have the great vision that the just shall live by faith? What was he doing?
Penance.
He was doing penance.
You just got
He was
tired of
crawling on his hands and knees up these stairs on pieces of broken glass. And they do that today. They'll break up glass all over these stairs up there, and at the top of them, Constantine's mother had the very top where there was a brass ring up there, and these stairs that were in Pilate's judgment hall, taken and moved all the way to Rome, and she had these stairs and stuff moved up there, and supposedly a drop of Jesus' blood was still on there, and she had it all moved to Rome, and people would climb these stairs and kiss that brass ring, and they would climb the stairs on gravel and broken glass, cutting themselves all the way. From little children to old people doing that. Voluntarily suffering. That's blasphemy. Christ suffered once. Once. All right? It's unprofitable and absurd. Number 10. They denied that the sins of departed spirits could be in any measure atoned for by the celebration of masses, or the distribution of alms to the poor, or a vicarious penance, and they treated the consequence, the doctrine of purgatory, as a ridiculous fable.
So Lutherans believe in purgatory too now? Or no?
It just depends upon now.
Back then.
The doctrine of praying for somebody. How many of you lost somebody in your family that you really love? You want to talk to them, don't you, still? You want to pray for them. You want to communicate with them. It's just something. You would like to atone for any sins that they have done so they could be with God, wouldn't you? That's something natural that's in us. It's human. It's a human nature thing. And this practice of doing this for so many years that has influenced so many people has so influenced society that we think that we can pray for the dead. The Mormon Church baptizes for the dead to get them into heaven. They're out there in limbo in the twilight zone, some places floating around out there, and they can't get to heaven unless somebody's baptized for them or in their name by proxy. And the Catholic Church but it's all absurd. We're born into this world. We're born, when we are conceived, we become an eternal being from that time on. We'll never die. Not in spirit. When your body dies, you go to be with God or to hell, one or the other. That's the only two places there is. There's no in between. You're going to go one place or the other. And that's what they're fighting for. And there's nothing that the living can do for the dead, because the dead has lived their lives. As the tree falls, so be it. That's it. Number 11. They considered marriage as a pernicious institution and absurdly condemned without distinction all connubial bonds. What were they, celibates? What were these people?
No, they didn't believe that the church had the authority to yes or no marriage.
They did not believe in marriage license. They fought that. Baptists fought that until this country, until they came to this country. Did you know that? And they would not even, and many, as a matter of fact, many Amish, which are Anabaptists, basically, of old, they won't let anybody tell them what they're going to do. They don't have any divorces, basically. They got marriages, and what they do is celebrate the marriage. They celebrate it. And their God is the one that marries. Well, Baptists has said, no church is going to tell me whether I can get married or not. That's between me and God. And that's what they said. Now, if you're going to control the masses, what do? You control their marrying, their births, and their burying. And then you've got control of them. And taxing. Well, Baptists never fought against paying taxes. We'll pay taxes. You know, no problem. We never had a Boston Tea Party yet.
But the problem is the more the higher taxes they're willing to pay, the closer to heaven you get.
Yeah. Well, that's right.
Yeah. Well, you have to give them credit, though, in the matter of divorce. I think that they take a position, the scripture on divorce.
What, the Baptists?
Well, the Roman Catholic Church.
They do. But really, there's even Christ, even the Lord got a divorce.
What?
Even the Lord got a divorce. Gave himself one from Israel. Look at that. Well, just think about that for a minute. He divorced her, set her aside, and called out his new bride. Israel will never be the bride of God again. She is divorced. She is divorced. God divorced her and set her aside forever. She will glorify God on this earth someday, and ruling and reigning in person upon this earth for that 1,000 years. But never will she be his bride again. That's over with. She's put away. God gave the reasons for divorce in the Old Testament because of the hardness of their hearts. Simple as that. Israel, when Christ had come, had been divorced as their wives. They had changed the law. Remember, the Pharisees said their commentaries on the Testament, on the Old Testament, were just as valid as the Old Testament itself. And their commentaries, they could get divorced. If you didn't like it, she snored. Get rid of her. You know, whatever. Number 12. They looked upon certain sort of veneration and worship as due to apostles and martyrs, from which, however, they excluded such as were only confessors. They were only pastors. In which class they comprehended the saints who had not suffered death for the cause of Christ, and whose bodies, in their esteem, had nothing more sacred than any other human carcass. They said St. Peter's bones were no more important than a coyote's bones out there in the field. Because he's not here. Those bones of St. Peter, those bones of St. Paul or Matthew or anybody are absolute no use to you to get you to heaven. It wouldn't do you any good.
In the fetus where she's talking about, right in the middle, supposedly have two of the disciples' coffins there above ground with acrylic covering, like I think it was like a gold plating over it.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't remember. I'm thinking Peter and John, but it was weird how these are the disciples right here.
Well, you know, they buried John the Baptist in 40 different places, and Paul and everything else. I mean, who knows where they are?
Yeah.
What matter does it? Their bones are of no importance at all. That's a graveyard. Bones are nasty, dirty. What do they call it today? Yucky? There's another term. There's another term that all the kids use.
Gross.
Gross. That's it, they're gross. So what? If it's Paul's gross bones or a coyote's gross bones, it's gross, whichever way you look at it. There's nothing holy about it. Christ is holy. God is holy. If we ever have any holiness at all, it's what we get from them. It's nothing what we can muster up or Paul or anybody else. Number 13, declared the use of instrumental music in the churches and other religious assemblies as superstitious and unlawful. How many of you ever heard of the Church of Christ?
Yeah.
All right. They will not have instrumental music. That's where this came from.
Yeah, they won't have a piano, but some of them will have a guitar, string instrument, but they don't. You can't tell them that.
You can't tell them they're not supposed to have this. But let's go back and find out, why did these Baptists sometimes went wrong? Did you know that? Sometimes they made mistakes, even in it. Sometimes it's possible for even Baptists to make mistakes. Well, there is one right there. The Catholic churches were spending thousands and thousands of dollars on these big orchestrations. They were Lutheran, Calvin. They had orchestras in their churches. They were productions. And it all came from the money of poor people's, it was food off of poor people's tables. And they said, we don't want to have anything to do with it. Let's back off. We won't have a guitar in the church. We won't have a fiddle. We won't have a horn. We won't have a drum. We won't have anything. We won't even have a bell. Why, we have the bell choir. They wouldn't have that at all. They said that's chasing away evil spirits or something. But look at it, we can make a joyful noise on the Lord. The Psalms, they were making David's people, they had instruments in there.
Well, this isn't necessarily that it was bad, as how they're using it for their glory rather than God.
It was for the glory of them and for their ears and not for the glory of God. Simple as that. And that's why they denied this. And I think they went a little too far. Mm-hmm. As simple as that. They might have just gone to the other side of the pasture too far and broke through the fence. Just a little bit, Brother Fred.
But in light of all of that, some of the greatest composers came out of that. Bach and Beethoven, Brahms, and so on.
Yeah. That's some of the greatest composers in history.
Yeah, and the music of Bach today, we honor the great Messiah. He composed the music to it, which is today much different than the contemporary music that we.
But in the times that they were composed, even at that time, that was all supported by the state churches, and it was productions. It was not so much for the glory of God, but for the glory of the people and what they did. And that's why they did what they did here. Number 14. They denied that the cross on which Christ suffered was in any respect more sacred than any other kind of wood, and consequently refused to pay to it any smallest degree of religious worship. They wouldn't have a cross on the church no way in the world, nor would they have a splinter from the cross of Jesus, because it wasn't anything. The blood of Jesus is important, not the cross. Simple as that. Go on a little further. Images of Christ and other saints, but also for having them removed out of the churches. They didn't believe in adoring any of the images of Christ or any other saint. And they wanted them out of the churches because they were idols. Mm-hmm. Number 16. They looked upon the subordination and distinctions that were established among the clergy. This is the main thing right here. Pastors and deacons over the churches, no. They were servants of the churches. And at the different degrees of authority that they were conferred upon the different members of that sacred body, they didn't believe in it. They said it was unlawful that a pastor have more power over people of the church. He didn't have any power. All he was a servant. The Lutherans, the Presbyterians, all the Protestants, and the old cathedrals, they had the pastor up high on an elevated platform. You know what? If a Baptist had a church building, you know what they did? And for many years, they dug a hole and put him in a hole and made him preach up to them. He was a servant, not to be looked up to and venerated as any great God or a great leader as far as they were concerned. Only Christ was worthy of any worship and esteem. And I think maybe they even went a little bit too far in that, because they were fighting against heresies that were real heresies. They were called the heretics, but they were the only ones that were telling the truth about God's Word. Thank you for your attention tonight. Father, thank you for your Word and for watching over us. Let these examples through history dwell in our hearts. Help us to be better Christians today because of it. Help us to understand that there's a right way and the wrong way, and there's a middle way, and sometimes even God's people go too far to the right or the left in extremes. Help us to be not extremists, not have hobby horses that we pound upon, but to be followers of Christ and your word and your truths. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.